Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really interesting angle on safety in aviation.
Yeah, we are.
Forget just counting accidents for a minute. We're going to look at something, well, much more nuanced. Whether pilots and others actually had a chance to steer things differently when an event unfolded.
Right.
Think of it as going beyond the final score and analyzing the crucial plays of the
But
game.
for so long, the headline in safety has been the accident rate. How many crashes.
Mm-hmm.
But this study we're looking at today suggests that focusing only on that number might be like trying to understand a movie by just watching the ending.
Yeah, you missed the whole plot.
We need to understand the moments where things could have gone differently, those decision points.
And that brings us straight to the heart of this deep dive, the concept of controllability.
That's the key word.
When something starts to go wrong, did the people involved have an opportunity to intervene, to change the trajectory? That's the central question we're exploring. To do this, we've got a study that dug into a massive 296 aviation safety investigation reports.
That's a lot of reports. These came from 5 different aviation authorities and covered a good chunk of time, from 1990 to 2014.
Right.
What makes this study particularly insightful is that it didn't just look at the outcomes, the final crash or incident severity.
Mm-hmm.
It really drilled down into how often pilots could control these situations,
Okay.
how familiar they were with what was happening. Was it a known drill or something out of the blue, and whether their actions ultimately helped or sometimes hindered the resolution.
So for you listening in, our goal today is to give you a much deeper understanding of what goes into aviation safety. We're doing that by putting these events under the microscope of controllability. It's a fresh way to look at things, moving past those top-level accident statistics.
Definitely a different lens.
Okay, so to get started, let's look at how we normally categorize safety events. What's the standard way of doing that?
Well, typically, across various high-risk industries, think railways, shipping, and of course, aviation safety events are classified based on how bad the outcome was.
Right, the consequences.
Exactly. We're talking about the severity of injuries, the amount of damage to equipment, environmental impact, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Regulatory bodies often use the frequency and rate of accidents, defined by these consequences, as key indicators of safety performance. How safe are we? Let's count the bad outcomes.
Right. So a major accident with fatalities is going to be classified much higher and get a lot more attention than, say, a minor incident where no one was hurt and there was minimal damage. That makes sense on the surface.
It does, but as this study points out, there's a real limitation to this approach, isn't there?
Yeah, what's the downside?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While understanding the severity of what happened is clearly important, this severity-based classification doesn't always give us the full picture of the event itself. It doesn't necessarily tell us if the situation could have been handled differently. Were there opportunities for intervention that were either seized or missed? That's the crucial information it often overlooks. It just looks at the end result.
And that's where this idea of classifying events by controllability comes into play. The study gives credit to Karanicas, who first proposed this concept back in 2015.
That's right, Karanicas kicked this off.
What were the original categories he suggested?
Karanicas' initial system included controlled events, which were then broken down into positive interventions where actions helped and negative interventions where they made things worse.
Okay, so controlled good, controlled bad.
Kind of. Then there were also uncontrolled events, where no real intervention took place or couldn't take place. And finally, a neutral category.
Neutral, what did that cover?
That was for outcomes that were seen as sort of inevitable or just standard reactions that didn't really change things significantly either way.
Okay, so it was trying to capture more than just a binary good or bad outcome. But this initial setup wasn't perfect, right? There were some refinements made.
Yeah.
What drove those changes?
Yes. After some initial real-world testing of that initial classification, it became apparent that different analysts were interpreting the neutral and even the positively controlled categories in slightly different ways.
Consistency issues.
Precisely. To make the system more consistent and reliable, they needed clearer and more distinct definitions. People needed to agree on what they were seeing.
So what did the revised controllability classification ultimately look like?
The amended classification has 3 key parts. First, event controllability. This is now much more straightforward. Controlled, meaning the user, usually the pilot, did something to influence the event, or uncontrolled, meaning no effective intervention occurred. Simple binary.
Okay, controlled or uncontrolled, what's next?
Second is the familiarity level. This looks at how familiar the people involved were with the situation they faced. Was this something they'd seen before or trained for?
Right.
It's either medium-high familiarity. Think of those situational surprises where standard procedures usually kick in, like maybe a standard engine failure drill.
Stuff you train for.
Yeah. Exactly. Or it's low-medium familiarity, which are the more fundamental surprises, the really weird stuff, requiring more knowledge, more experience, maybe some creative thinking to handle.
Okay, so how normal or out of the blue the problem was. And the third part.
The third is the reaction effect, and this only applies to events that were already classified as controlled.
Makes sense. If it wasn't controlled, there's no reaction effect to judge.
Right. So it's either positive, meaning the actions taken either improved the situation or at least prevented it from getting worse, things were managed well, or it's negative, meaning the actions unfortunately led to a worse outcome.
So the neutral category was removed,
Okay.
and this new familiarity level became a central element. Why the focus on how familiar this situation was? What was the thinking there?
Well, the researchers realized that how our brains process unexpected events is critical. If you've encountered a situation before or something very similar, you're likely to react more effectively, right?
Yeah, muscle memory, procedure recall.
Exactly. Familiarity with the unfolding event, whether it's a well-rehearsed scenario or something completely new, has a huge impact on how well someone can respond under pressure. It really changes the game.
That makes perfect sense. If you've trained for an engine failure on takeoff 100 times, you're much more likely to handle it well than if you encounter some completely novel, bizarre system malfunction you've never even heard of.
Precisely.
And this revised classification was tested for reliability, right?
Yeah.
How did that go? Did different people agree when using it?
Yes, absolutely crucial step. To make sure the classification system was solid and could be used consistently by different people, they conducted reliability testing. And they found a substantial level of agreement among different analysts who used this revised framework. That gave them confidence that it was a robust tool for analyzing safety events, not just based on subjective feelings.
All right, so we've got this new way of looking at things. Controllability, familiarity, reaction effect. Solid framework. Now, how did the researchers actually apply this classification to a wider range of events? That takes us to the methodology of the study.
Right, so the researchers took this amended controllability classification and applied it to a pretty significant data set, 296 aviation investigation reports.
Okay.
And these weren't just from one country or one organization. They came from 5 different aviation authorities. They're kept anonymous in the paper, just labeled A1 through A5.
To avoid pointing fingers, I guess?
Probably, and to focus on the patterns. The idea was to see how this classification system worked across different reporting styles, maybe different cultures, different operational contexts,
Makes sense.
and the time frame.
The reports covered a pretty long period, from 1990 all the way to 2014. And importantly, they included events of all levels of severity, from minor incidents right up to major accidents.
So they weren't just looking at the catastrophic failures. They included the whole spectrum of reported safety events, the near misses too. Exactly.
Yeah.
They wanted to see if controllability patterns differed depending on how serious the event actually turned out to be.
What was their process for actually analyzing these reports? I imagine reading nearly 300 investigation reports is intense.
Oh, definitely. The research team went through each investigation report in detail. They studied every section, the factual information, the analysis of what happened, the investigators' conclusions, everything.
Wow.
They then systematically recorded the values for each of their classification variables: event controllability, control uncontrolled, familiarity level, medium, high, low, medium, and the reaction effect, positive, negative, if the event was controlled.
And put it all in a spreadsheet.
Pretty much. All this data went into a spreadsheet for analysis. It was a really in-depth undertaking. They note it required around 320 hours of their time, just the analysis part.
Wow, that's a serious commitment to digging into these details. And they didn't just look at controllability, did they? They also noted down other characteristics of each event.
That's right. Smart move. They also recorded various other factors that are often considered important in aviation safety, trying to see what else might be related.
Like what sort of things?
This included things like the type and age of the aircraft involved, the kind of operation it was, like commercial passenger flight versus a cargo flight or general aviation, the phase of flight when the event occurred, takeoff, cruise, landing, etc.
Okay.
The specific type of event itself, like a runway excursion or a technical failure, CFIT, loss of control, the overall severity of the event, incident, serious incident, accident, and also whether fatigue of the crew or ground staff was identified as a contributing factor.
Right, so a whole host of variables.
Yeah, this allowed them to look for potential links, associations between these factors and how controllable the events were or how familiar people were with them.
Okay, so they've built their framework, they've meticulously analyzed this huge pile of data. Now, what did they actually discover? Let's get into the results of this deep dive into safety reports. What did the numbers show?
Okay, results time. Across the 317 individual cases, they analyzed, it's a bit more than the 296 reports, because some reports covered multiple events or aircraft, apparently.
Ah, okay.
The overall distribution of their classification characteristics was quite telling. They found that in a significant majority, 75.7% of the cases, the events were classified as controlled.
3/4 were controlled, meaning someone did intervene.
Yes, exactly. Someone did something that influenced the outcome. Only about a quarter, 24.3%, were deemed uncontrolled, where no effective intervention happened or could happen.
So in the vast majority of investigated events, there was some opportunity for human intervention, or at least an attempt was made. What about how familiar the people involved were with those situations?
This is interesting. The dominant familiarity level was actually low-medium.
Really? Not the standard procedures stuff?
Nope. In 67.5% of the cases, so over two-thirds, the events involved at least one fundamental surprise, something that required more in-depth understanding and experience to handle effectively, rather than just following standard procedures. Only about a third, 32.5% of events were classified as medium-high familiarity, the more routine emergencies, if you can call them that.
That suggests that even in events that are serious enough to be investigated, a large proportion involve unexpected or novel elements that really test the crew.
It really does.
And for those events where people did intervene and exert control, that 75%, what was the outcome of those actions? Positive or negative reaction effect?
Okay, so for the events classified as controlled, the reaction effect was positive in most cases, 71.3%.
So mostly good interventions.
Mostly. This means that the actions taken either didn't make things worse or actually led to a successful resolution. The situation was managed well. However, in a notable chunk, 28.7%, almost 30% of the controlled events, the reaction was classified as negative.
Meaning the actions taken, unfortunately, contributed to a worse outcome.
That's what the classification implies, yes. Yeah. The intervention didn't help and might have hindered.
That's a pretty significant chunk of interventions that didn't go as hoped. Were there any interesting connections or patterns between these different characteristics they looked at? Like, did familiarity link to reaction?
Absolutely. One really key finding, probably one of the most important, was the very strong link between the familiarity level and the reaction effect. It turned out that all of the medium-high familiarity events, the ones involving situations where standard procedures likely applied, were positively controlled. Every single one.
Perfect record for the familiar problems.
Right. But conversely, every single event that was negatively controlled where the intervention made things worse involved a low-medium familiarity level.
Wow. So if you're in unfamiliar territory, the chance of a negative outcome from your actions goes way up.
It seems that way. This really underscores the idea that when pilots and others are dealing with situations they are less familiar with, those fundamental surprises, there's a much higher risk that their actions, even if well-intentioned, might inadvertently make the situation worse.
That's a crucial takeaway. So how familiar you are with the unfolding situation seems to be a really strong indicator of how successful any intervention might be. The study also looked for statistical links between those other event variables, like the type of aircraft or the phase of flight, and the controllability classifications, right?
Yeah.
What were some of the more significant associations they found there? Did anything stand out?
Yes, they uncovered several statistically significant associations, which are detailed in their Table 4 for anyone looking at the paper. For instance, there were clear differences in both controllability and positive reaction effects across the 5 different aviation authorities they studied.
Different countries or regions showed different patterns?
Seems so. Authority A2, for example, tended to have a higher proportion of controllable events overall, while Authority A5 had a lower proportion. And when they looked at positive reaction effects, successful interventions, authorities A3 and A2 had higher rates, whereas Authority A4 had a lower rate of positive outcomes from controlled events.
That's interesting. So even among these presumably well-established aviation safety systems, there were noticeable variations in how controllable events tended to be and how well interventions went. What about the characteristics of the aircraft itself, like its age? Did that matter?
When they looked at aircraft age, yeah, they found something. Newer aircraft, those 6 years old or less, were more often associated with medium-high familiarity events.
More routine stuff.
Right. On the other hand, older aircraft over 25 years old were more frequently linked to low-medium familiarity events, the surprises.
Any thoughts on why? Technology?
It could potentially reflect the different technologies and maybe the operational procedures associated with newer versus older generations of aircraft, maybe more automation smoothing things out in newer jets.
That makes sense. Newer planes might have more standardized automated systems that handle common issues more predictably. What about the type of aircraft, like jet versus propeller, and its weight? Did those factors show any associations?
Yes, they did. Jet aircraft tended to have a higher proportion of controlled events overall. And they also showed a different balance between low-medium and medium-high familiarity compared to propeller-driven and rotary-wing helicopter aircraft.
And weight.
Similarly, heavier aircraft were also associated with more controlled events and a different familiarity profile compared to lighter aircraft.
So, bigger, heavier jets seem more controllable in these investigated events.
The data points that way.
Yeah.
Again, this might be related to the greater complexity and often higher levels of automation found in larger jet-powered aircraft used in, say, commercial transport.
And how did the operational context of the flight, like whether it was a commercial flight versus a private flight, seem to influence controllability?
Commercial air transport, or CAT, operations, those are your standard airline flights.
Right.
They were more likely to be controlled and also showed a different ratio of familiarity levels compared to other types of flying, like general aviation or cargo.
And passengers specifically.
Passenger flights, specifically, also exhibited a higher controllability and a different familiarity profile compared to flights that weren't carrying passengers, like cargo or ferry flights.
Why do you think that is? Stricter rules, better training.
It likely reflects factors like more standardized operating procedures, maybe more advanced aircraft typically used, and perhaps more rigorous crew training that are typical in commercial passenger aviation compared to some other sectors.
What about the different stages of a flight? Were there any phases like takeoff or landing that stood out in terms of how controllable events tended to be?
Interestingly, yes. Ground events, things that happen while the aircraft is taxiing, parked, maybe during pushback.
Okay.
They were associated with more medium-high familiarity situations and more positive intervention effects compared to the en route phase of flight or other phases like climb or descent.
Huh. Why would things be more familiar or better handled on the ground?
Well, it might be because ground operations often involve more standardized, well-defined procedures, and perhaps crucially, there's often more time to assess and respond to issues compared to the more dynamic phases of flight where things happen much faster.
Less time pressure on the ground. Makes sense. And finally, what about the specific types of events they looked at? Things like runway excursions, technical failures, or loss of control. Did those have distinct controllability characteristics?
Yes, definitely some patterns there. Runway excursions and technical failures were generally found to be mostly controlled events. Someone usually tried to do something.
Right.
The controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT, flying a perfectly good airplane into the ground or an obstacle, those events were the least likely to be controlled. Often, sadly, no intervention happens before impact.
Grim. What else?
Mid-air collisions, MASI events, had the fewest instances of low-medium familiarity, maybe because the threat is often visible or alerted, whereas power failures, potential loss of control in-flight, LOCI events, showed higher proportions of low-medium familiarity than nasty surprises.
And the reaction effectiveness for these types.
It's also notable that CFIT events had the highest rate of negative control effects, meaning interventions, if they happened, often made things worse or were too late. Mid-air collisions had the fewest negative effects, perhaps because avoidance is more binary.
Right. And severity overall. Did that link clearly?
Oh yeah, a very clear trend. As the severity of the event increased, moving from minor incidents up to serious incidents and then to accidents, they observed a clear decrease in controllability and medium-high familiarity.
So worse outcomes linked to less control and more surprises.
Exactly. And, correspondingly, an increase in negative reaction effects. Accidents had the lowest controllability, lowest MHF, and highest rate of negative reactions.
That paints a pretty clear picture. Anything else significant? Fatigue.
Yes, one last important one. The study found a significant association between crew or ground staff fatigue being identified as a factor and an increased likelihood of negative reaction effects when an intervention was attempted.
So being tired makes it more likely you'll make things worse if you try to fix a problem.
That's what the data suggests. Fatigue impairs performance. especially under pressure.
Those are a lot of really insightful connections. Now, let's step back and try to put this all together. What's the big picture that emerges when we look at these findings from the discussion section of the paper?
While the overarching picture suggests that while in a significant number of investigated events, people did manage to exert control, which, gives us valuable opportunities to learn from successful interventions. The safety two idea.
Learning from what goes right.
Exactly. But on the other hand, a substantial proportion of serious incidents were classified as uncontrolled. About a quarter overall, remember.
Right.
These uncontrolled events represent potential missed opportunities to understand weaknesses in the system, vulnerabilities that could lead to more severe outcomes down the line if they're not addressed.
So uncontrolled incidents might be warnings we're missing.
Could be. It's also quite interesting that despite the general trend of declining accident rates over the period of the study, which is good news generally.
Yeah, flying has gotten safer statistically.
Right. But the overall controllability of events, based on this analysis, didn't show a significant improvement over that same time. Nor did familiarity levels or reaction effectiveness change much.
So the fact that accident rates are going down might not necessarily mean we're getting fundamentally better at controlling things when they start to go wrong. Maybe other factors are driving the rate down.
That's a provocative thought, isn't it? Maybe technology is preventing some events from starting, but when they do start, our ability to manage them hasn't changed as much as the overall rate implies.
What about that link between how controllable an event is and how severe it becomes? That seems really important from the discussion.
It is indeed. The discussion really emphasizes this. Even in accidents and serious incidents, which by their nature are always investigated because of their severity, the study found that flight crews often did manage to successfully intervene and mitigate potentially even worse outcomes.
So even in bad situations, there are often successes within them.
Yes, and this highlights those crucial learning moments. We need to study how they managed that partial success. However, the strong correlation they found between accidents and low-medium familiarity conditions is a clear warning sign.
The surprises are the killers.
Basically, yes. Truly unexpected, novel situations are much more likely to result in severe consequences. And the fact that they also saw a considerable number of uncontrolled and low-medium familiarity incidents and serious incidents, well, that raises a concern.
About what?
About potentially unreported, less severe events that might share these same dangerous characteristics. If we only investigate the really bad ones, are we missing the precursors in the incidents that didn't crash but were uncontrolled or involved big surprises?
That's a really good point. The study also pointed out differences between the 5 different aviation authorities they looked at. What are the potential implications of those regional variations discussed?
Yeah, the discussion highlights this too. The fact that they saw regional variations in both how controllable events were and the effectiveness of interventions suggests that there might be real differences in things like pilot training programs, maybe the general level of pilot competency or experience, and even the cultural norms around safety reporting and investigation in those different regions.
So how things are done locally might really matter.
It could. However, the authors are careful, and we should be too, cautioning against drawing firm conclusions or making direct comparisons, like ranking them based on just these 5 unnamed authorities and this data set. It's indicative, not definitive.
But the example they gave was quite stark, wasn't it? About country A3 versus A4.
Yes, that was a great illustration. Country A3 apparently had years with 0 accidents. Looks great on paper, right?
Fantastic.
But this analysis showed they had a number of uncontrolled incidents, so maybe some luck involved, whereas country A4 had a higher accident rate, which looks worse.
Not so good.
But their less severe events, the incidents, were more often fully controlled. It really shows how relying solely on accident rates can give a misleading picture when you're trying to compare safety performance across different regions or organizations. Controllability adds another dimension.
That's a really powerful example of why looking at controllability can give us a much richer, maybe more accurate understanding than just counting accidents. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into some of those other event variables they discussed. Aircraft characteristics, age, type, weight seem to play a role.
Yes, the discussion links the finding that younger, heavier jet aircraft were more associated with medium-high familiarity levels and controlled events. It links that quite strongly to the increasing levels of automation in modern aircraft.
More automation equals more control.
Potentially, yes. These sophisticated systems are designed to handle many common abnormal situations and provide pilots with more advanced decision support, making those situations feel more familiar or procedural.
But there's a but, isn't there?
There usually is. This also brings up a really important discussion point about the potential trade-off. Are we becoming too reliant on automation? Does it potentially erode fundamental manual flying skills or the deep situational awareness pilots need when faced with truly unexpected events that the automation might not be designed to handle?
It's that constant balancing act, isn't it? Automation is a great tool for routine problems, but might leave pilots less prepared for the truly bizarre ones if they don't keep their hands-on skills sharp.
Exactly. It's a huge topic in aviation safety right now.
What about the nature of the flight itself? Commercial air transport versus general aviation, passengers versus cargo. How did the discussion explain those links to controllability?
Well, the discussion suggests the fact that commercial air transport, CT operations, and passenger flights tended to be more controllable and involve more medium-high familiarity situations, likely reflects a combination of factors we touched on.
Like the planes and the rules.
Yeah, these types of operations typically use more modern and automated aircraft. Plus, there are generally more standardized operating procedures, more regulatory oversight, and probably more comprehensive and recurrent crew training programs compared to some other sectors of aviation, like, say, recreational flying.
And what about the flight phase difference? Why were things less controllable, more surprising, and had worse outcomes during climb, cruise, or descent compared to being on the ground?
The thinking there is likely the increased complexity and the more dynamic nature of these airborne phases. Things happen faster. Plus, there's potentially less time available to fully assess and react to unexpected issues compared to when the aircraft is safely on the ground, maybe with engines off or at idle. Standardization helps on the ground too.
Okay. And what about the different event types discussed? Runway excursions, technical failures, CFIT, they seem to have quite different controllability profiles. What did the discussion infer from that?
Right. The discussion highlighted the high controllability of runway excursions, but also their mixed reaction effectiveness. It suggests that while pilots frequently have an opportunity to intervene, the success of those interventions varies a lot. Maybe the procedures aren't always clear, or the situation degrades too fast.
And technical failures.
The high rate of successful control in technical failures was potentially attributed to well-established procedures and extensive training for known technical issues. You practice engine failures, hydraulic failures.
Right.
But the prevalence of low-medium familiarity within technical failures might point to the challenges of dealing with more complex, perhaps cascading system failures that aren't explicitly covered in the manual. The really weird tech problems.
The unknown unknowns in the tech.
Sort of. And this raises an interesting question they pose. Could the training approaches used for technical failures, especially adapting to less familiar scenarios, provide insights that could be applied to improving training for those more vulnerable event types like runway excursions, loss of control, and CFIT, where interventions are less consistently successful?
Cross-pollinating training ideas.
Potentially. And the clear link they found between fatigue and an increased risk of unsuccessful interventions really reinforces, yet again, the critical importance of effective fatigue risk management for everyone involved.
It sounds like, as discussed, while the characteristics of the aircraft and the level of automation might influence the initial potential for controllability and the level of familiarity, the ultimate success of an intervention often boils down to human factors.
That seems to be a core message. The skills, knowledge, decision-making, teamwork, maybe even the stress management of the individuals and teams involved, which can vary significantly depending on training, experience, fatigue, and the operational context.
It's that human-machine interaction again.
Precisely. Technology provides a foundation, maybe raises the baseline, but the ability of the flight crew to effectively utilize that technology, integrated with their own skills and experience, especially in the face of something truly unexpected, is often what determines the outcome.
The study also made a point of comparing its findings to the original work by Karanicas back in 2015. What were the main similarities or differences they discussed?
Yeah, they contextualized their results. One notable difference they pointed out was that their study seemed to find a slightly lower proportion of uncontrolled events compared to Karanicas' initial study.
Why might that be?
They suggest it might be because that earlier research included a broader range of lower severity events, maybe even non-reportable occurrences, within just a single organization. Whereas this study focused on formally investigated events from multiple authorities, which tend to be more significant by definition. So different data sets.
Apples and slightly different apples.
Kind of. However, both studies consistently found a high rate of positive reaction effects when control was exerted. People usually helped when they intervened. And both also noted a link between lower severity events and higher overall controllability. Less serious events were more often controlled.
Okay, so some consistency there. Anything else?
Interestingly, the association that Karanika's original work found between the age of the aircraft and controllability wasn't clearly replicated in this larger, more diverse dataset.
Why not?
They suggest it's likely because this study included a much wider range of aircraft types and ages across the 5 different authorities, which might have washed out or complicated that specific relationship found in the earlier, narrower study.
So a broader perspective with more diverse data can sometimes reveal a more nuanced picture, or perhaps show that earlier findings weren't universally applicable.
Exactly. It highlights the value of replicating research across different contexts.
Finally, in the discussion, how does this whole concept of controllability classification align with modern safety thinking, particularly ideas like resilience engineering?
The authors argue, and I think quite convincingly, that the controllability classification actually fits very well with the core principles of resilience engineering
How so?
because it shifts the focus. Instead of just analyzing failures after they happen, which is traditional safety ally, it tries to understand the ability of operators and systems to handle both expected and unexpected challenges successfully. That's resilience.
Managing surprises.
Right. By looking at how often individuals can intervene effectively, especially in those difficult low-medium familiarity situations that represent novel surprises, we gain valuable insights into the resilience of the overall system.
So a controlled event, especially if the reaction was positive in a tough situation, is a sign of resilience.
Exactly. Successfully managed unexpected events are a key indicator of a resilient system, one that can adapt and respond effectively to unforeseen circumstances, to bounce back. This classification framework can help us identify areas where the system is inherently resilient. Maybe we can learn from those successes and also pinpoint areas where we might need to build more resilience to handle situations that fall outside standard operating procedures.
Connecting it to resilience concepts.
Yeah, they even suggest links to the 4 cornerstones of resilience: the capacity to respond to events, that's controllability and reaction, to anticipate potential problems, maybe familiarity relates here, to monitor system performance, and crucially, to learn from both successes and failures.
So it's not just about failure investigation.
No. Ultimately, using the lens of controllability and safety investigations can help us move beyond just identifying immediate human errors, the blame game, and instead focus on understanding the underlying systemic factors and the opportunities we have to enhance the ability of the entire system, people, procedures, technology, to maintain control in a wider range of challenging circumstances.
It's about learning not just from when things go wrong, but also, crucially, from those many instances where things could have gone much worse but were brought back under control. Okay, so wrapping this up, after this extensive analysis of these aviation safety reports through the lens of controllability, what are the key concluding messages or takeaways that emerge?
All right, the conclusion boils down to a few key messages. First, a significant proportion of investigated safety events, around a quarter in this study, were ultimately uncontrolled, highlighting potential systemic vulnerabilities we need to understand better.
Okay, uncontrolled events are a major flag.
Second, in the majority of events where control was exerted, it often required the people involved to use higher-level cognitive skills, real thinking, to deal with less familiar situations. And encouragingly, these interventions were mostly successful in preventing worse outcomes. People generally do well under pressure.
Good news there.
Third, we saw that clear and concerning link. Lower controllability and less familiarity are strongly associated with events that end up being more severe, especially accidents.
The surprises and lack of control lead to worse endings.
Pretty much. Fourth, those regional differences we saw suggest that just looking at overall accident rates doesn't give us a complete picture of safety performance across different parts of the aviation world. Context matters.
Need to look deeper than the headline number.
Exactly. And perhaps surprisingly, despite all the advancements in aviation technology and training over the nearly 25 years covered by the study, the overall controllability of events, the levels of familiarity experience, and the effectiveness of reactions didn't show significant improvement.
That's a bit sobering. We're not necessarily getting better at handling the unexpected.
This data suggests maybe not as much as we'd hope, or maybe the challenges are evolving too. Of course, we need to add the caveat the authors mention. This study has its limitations. We can't necessarily generalize all these findings to the entire global aviation sector based on this sample of reports from just 5 authorities and the way they group some variables.
Fair enough. But even with those limitations in mind, the study seems to suggest some really interesting and potentially valuable practical applications for this controllability classification in the real world of aviation safety. What did they propose?
Absolutely. They move beyond just analysis. For example, this suggests the concept of controllability could be used as a key factor in deciding which incidents to investigate more deeply.
How so?
Prioritizing those events that were classified as uncontrolled, even if they had minor outcomes, might yield the richest insights into underlying system weaknesses before they lead to something worse. Focus on where control was lost.
Interesting. What else?
The specific order of the classification variables first. Was it controlled? Then, what was the familiarity level? And finally, what was the effect of the reaction? Could also provide a useful framework to structure and guide the investigation process itself, like a checklist.
A logical flow for investigators.
Yeah. Furthermore, the study proposes that these controllability characteristics could be incorporated into voluntary safety reporting systems like ASRS or internal airline reports,
How would that work?
maybe by using simple scales. Pilots or controllers could rate, how controllable did this situation feel? How familiar were you with this? Did your actions help? This could provide a much richer data set on the precursors to accidents and incidents, capturing near misses from the user's perspective.
Getting proactive data.
Right. And finally, when conducting risk assessments, focusing specifically on areas or situations where analysis suggests controllability is inherently low, could help target safety interventions, training, procedures, designed much more effectively. Put resources where control is weakest.
So it's not just an academic exercise. There are real practical ways this different perspective can be used to potentially improve safety. Any final thoughts from the conclusion on the broader significance of taking this approach?
My final thought, echoing the paper's conclusion, is that this study really underscores the value of moving towards a more balanced approach to safety management, one that actively seeks to learn from successes, those instances where things were brought back under control, sometimes against the odds.
Safety, too.
Exactly. Learning from what works as much as it learns from failures.
Yeah.
Safety one. And crucially, when we analyze how effective reactions were, the primary goal should always be system improvement, identifying opportunities for better training, better procedures, better design, rather than simply trying to assign blame to individuals who are likely doing their best in a tough spot.
System focus, not blame focus.
Absolutely. Overall, this controllability classification offers a valuable alternative, or perhaps a necessary addition, to solely focusing on the outcomes of safety events. It has the potential to be a more insightful indicator of true safety performance and could, maybe, allow for more meaningful benchmarking across different parts of the aviation industry if adopted more widely.
And future work.
The study rightly points out the need for future research to delve deeper into understanding the specific characteristics of events that make them inherently uncontrollable. What are the factors? Time pressure, information overload, system complexity, design flaws that prevent effective intervention in the first place. Knowing that could be huge.
That's a crucial question to explore further understanding the roots of uncontrollability. And on that thought-provoking note, here's our final consideration for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Think about how this idea of understanding the controllability of events could be applied in any field you're involved in, maybe healthcare, technology development, finance, project management, even just your own daily life and decisions.
An interesting parallel.
Could focusing on the potential for intervention for control and learning from both successful and unsuccessful attempts lead to more proactive and ultimately more effective ways of managing risk and ensuring safety, rather than just reacting after the fact to what has already gone wrong?
It's about empowerment and learning.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to make a difference when things start to deviate and learning from those moments of control, both the good outcomes and the bad ones, to build more resilient systems everywhere. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.